purpose. A few quotes that I got. There was this uncertainty. We don't know what was going to happen. There was no future. Somebody else said, well, those who got along with the Japanese had some ulterior motive, and usually it was making money. And then one writer said the Japanese brutality was accompanied by, quote, the searing discovery that our own people were lending themselves readily and willingly as instruments of that brutality. And for what? For gain, for extra rations, extra amenities, more cigarettes. Impressions of the Japanese. And again, I'm quoting various writers here, but the comments were, some of them were cads, and this is very old-fashioned language, isn't it? Cads and buffoons. Others were gentlemen who would win the suffrage of any decent company. The people were impressed with the dedication of the Japanese. The British fought in order to live, the Japanese in order to die. And there was a tremendous impact of the Japanese discipline. So after the surrender, Japanese soldiers were sent to cut grass at Tasek Lugor. They worked 10.5 hours per day without stopping. And people there began to say, if you were a diligent person, sudah nak jadi Jepun, becoming like the Japanese. If you're lazy, then you should try to become like the Japanese. Cobalah jadi macam Jepun. And when you look at the accounts written by Malaysians who lived through the occupation, they very often reflect mixed feelings. So you have terminology like pahit manis, bittersweet, or suka duka, pleasure and sorrow, in describing the occupation. This is the Japanese soldiers after the surrender. They're working on a jetty in the Riau archipelago. And a last picture here, you see pictures very often of Allied prisoners of war, of Europeans who have not eaten very well for a long time and their skin and bones. You rarely see this. But what you must understand is that while many Indian soldiers who'd been sent to Malaya agreed to work for the Japanese, not all did. And those who refused to were kept in the same conditions as the British and suffered the same outcome. So one of the curious things that I find thinking over what happened in terms of writing about the occupation, you have different perspectives. You have an Allied perspective, and this Allied perspective begins with the propaganda that comes out even before the war. And it's reinforced by wartime propaganda. When the Allies returned to Southeast Asia, they simply reinforce that image of what the war was all about. And if you look at school textbooks, you find that story is perpetuated. The Japanese did a very bad thing. They came and they drove out the British. But there's something peculiar about that narrative, because there were quite a few people in Malaya who really wanted the British to be driven out. So that story is colored very much by the fact that that's the story that the Allies told. The Allies were victorious. So it becomes a little bit of victor's history. There's a second version, which you very rarely see. And when you see it, it doesn't look very good. But this is the version of the Japanese who, to this day, feel that they did the right thing. That their coming into Southeast Asia was well-intentioned. Maybe it didn't work out as well as it should have, but that they were doing something good. And then you have a third narrative, which is put out by Japanese scholars who feel that what the Japanese army and government did in the 1930s was completely wrong, and are very critical of it. What you don't see is a narrative built on Southeast Asia. And I was really struck by this as I was going through various books and so on, collecting material on this, that you have a lot of autobiographies written by people who experienced the occupation. And generally what they have in there is my childhood. You go through their life, and at some point, here's the occupation. Probably one chapter in the book. And then the occupation ends, they get on with their lives. And I think in many respects, that's what the occupation was in Southeast Asia. It was an episode. It was a harsh time. But for many people, it wasn't an absolutely conclusive, defining time. And I started off saying that if you look at histories of Malaysia, very often they go up to 1940 or they start in 1945. And I think what you find if you add in the occupation, you discover there's an awful lot of continuity between what was going on in the 1930s and what goes on after 1945. And I could be quite boringly academic about this, but centralized planning, an increase in government control. This all dates not from the occupation, or more it dates from the 1930s. It's a response to the Depression. The Japanese period doesn't change that. And when the British come back, they pursue policies in most respects that were initiated in the 1930s. There were a lot of studies done during the occupation trying to suggest what should be done after the war. How should, these are within the British Civil Service, what should we be doing that's different? The one big thing that they tried to change was to centralize the government in the Malayan Union. And there was strong resistance to that, as most everyone knows, and the Malayan Union lasts a couple of years and it's replaced by the Federation of Malaya. But in most other respects, the conclusion when they studied agricultural policy or various other things was pre-war policies were generally on the right track and should be continued. What happens immediately after the war? You have the British military administration come in and control things for about 6 months. Now there was a big debate at that time because you had various people saying, we want to change the way things are done, but we have to change it now. We have to change it immediately at the end of the war, because if we allow things to get started as they were before, later on it's going to be very difficult to change. The military said, our job is not to change anything. Our job is to stabilize the situation, and then when that's all done, we will hand over to civilians, and they can make changes or not. So the military administration lasted for 6 months, and just as the civilians expected, the pre-war patterns were reestablished, and when the civilian rule was restored, change was pretty much impossible. So in fact, I think the outcome of all this is that, the outcome of the occupation is that not really all that much changed. So I think maybe I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we will have questions from the floor.
Raja Rao, presently living in Kuala Lumpur, but definitely a very loyal Penangite. I grew at a time when the Japanese were, in fact, occupying Penang. And if my recollection of it slightly faded in terms of facts, then I have to apologize, particularly after you gave us such an overwhelming description of a fantastic career of Professor Paul. My comments is, while there appears to be a slight tendency to discuss about the brutality of the British occupation, we must not forget.
You mean Japanese occupation or British occupation?
Japanese occupation,
Japanese.
sorry. You must not forget that during wars there is always brutality. And I think all of us know about it, and my advice is we should avoid wars. But that being aside, the Japanese, when they were here, had definite relationship with the Chinese, which was, of course, as you quite correctly stated, brutal and severe, and there is still discussion about the 50 million extraction that they wanted as compensation for what the Chinese did to them when they were trying to occupy Manchuria and through all the serious torture systems there. The second thing is they were quite neutral, if not slightly in favor of the Indians, because particularly after Subhash Chandra Bose came here and the INA formed, and the Balak Sena was formed. I was a member of the Balak Sena. I was hardly 10 years old. We were all supporting the Japanese most enthusiastically, the Indians. The Christians was also for them. For many of the Christians, the Eurasians, so long as they put a picture of Mahatma Gandhi or Chandra Bose in front of their doors, they were left completely in peace. I myself was witness not to your 4 stakes of heads stuck somewhere else, but as many heads as 10 to 12 bleeding heads in Si Kam Tiam, Magazine Road Circus. My brothers, 2 elder brothers, were part of the Kunren show. A 3rd brother was involved in the death railway system. And so the Indians were very much in favor of the Japanese, largely because of British colonialism, and they were anxious to free India. With the Malays, the Japanese were not as dumb as we thought them to be. They were quite crafty and worked together with the Malays, particularly the royalty, and allowed them even to hold civil positions. That is not just my recollection of the facts, because I was also there for a time in Ipoh, in Perak, and I saw how the systems worked. I might have been very young, but quite alert, especially with my family members very much involved with the INA system. My sister learned Japanese to become a Japanese teacher. I not only knew katakana, hiragana, but even kanji by the time I was 11 or 12. So it is not, as you said, katakana nippongo, it's aka tasana hamayarawayin in the katakana. So those are the questions that I would like your comments. How did the Japanese, were they in fact treating us like the way, as I mentioned? And finally is, the Japanese were not entirely responsible for the deteriorating economic situation. The British, before they left Malaysia, even in Penang, believed in this scorched earth policy and destroyed not just bridges and roads, but even rubber estates and flooded tin mines. And these facts are available in many doctoral theses. I can remember one is Professor Hong Kim Kun, I think, or Kung Kim Hon. But I am so old now, the names don't come so easily to me. So they were merely repeating. And they were trying to resurrect all these things, but you quite correctly stated, not so much for their own military needs, but for the survival of the country itself. Thank you. And I really enjoyed your talk. It was so objective and so many interesting things mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thankful that you were coming, and I'm very pleased to see you, and I'm very pleased that you enjoyed the talk. I think the problem with the economy was that the whole concept of Greater Asia, the co-prosperity sphere, came along very late. It wasn't really announced until around 1940, and it wasn't very well worked out. I mean, you're certainly right that the Japanese were concerned about what was going to happen to the economy. And one of the big issues that they have across Southeast Asia is that their shipping, I mean, a lot of the shipping that was in the region before was sailed out of the region by the shipping companies. The ships that survive were under attack. In the Straits of Malacca, the Japanese really didn't control the Straits of Malacca, and so you had submarines and air attacks even on shipping. As the war moved into the South China Sea, shipping from Japan down to Southeast Asia was under attack. So there were proposals to bring looms, for example, for the cotton industry, looms from Japan down to Southeast Asia, bring experts to train people in various skills. Some of those experts were on ships that were sunk, and the shipping that was left, by and large, was used for military purposes and not for the civilian economy. Had there been no war, presumably the Japanese would have done much better in trying to do something with the economy, but they were trying to fight a major war, and their resources were really focused much more on that than on anything else. So far as their relations with the Indians, they made some really serious mistakes, I guess you would say, in Singapore. There was this famous rally in Farrer Park, and so the speeches that were given, you had soldiers who'd come from the Punjab, and you had the Tamil population from Singapore. And so they gave speeches in Punjabi, and they didn't give any speech in Tamil. And the next day there was some excuse made saying, well, it was because the soldiers were tired and they had to go back to their barracks, so we had to end the rally early. But it alienated the Tamil population because they hadn't been addressed. And you see a certain amount of, I'd say, cynicism about the Tamils. And so in the Japanese plans, in trying to repel a potential invasion, the Tamils were put out in the front line. Not because they were the best fighters, but simply because they were expendable and they could delay the invasion. The stronger fighters were going to be put behind them. And I think there was really, I guess we have to call it racism on the part of the Japanese, differentiating between different elements within the Indian community. I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. But, thank you.
Okay, that's very interesting. Do you have any more questions? Yeah, gentleman at the back there.
A student from Penang also, and actually I was just quite curious. I don't really know much about this tribe actually. You earlier stated that the people to food calorie ratio is 503, increased from 253 before the war, right? So how did you know that it was because there were less people or because they were producing more food?
Well, what those figures increased food production in Malaya, and that those efforts had led to an increase in the amount of food available, but it wasn't enough to compensate for the loss of imports. I mean, these figures are obviously very imprecise, but what's quite clear is that when the British came back, there was widespread malnutrition. But they were very surprised that people didn't look more malnourished. But when they began doing studies, they found lots of symptoms of deficiency diseases, bleeding gums, things of that sort. People had survived on root crops, on tapioca, on whatever could be found locally. And it wasn't an adequate diet. I mean, the astonishing thing, if you look at the plantation area on the coast of Perak or down into maybe Sembilan, before the war, something like 65% of the rice consumed in that area was imported. And when imports stopped, and they stopped because of shipping problems, there was plenty of rice up in Burma, but the rice couldn't be brought down into the peninsula because of no shipping. But when those imports stopped, people had to grow food locally. But what happens? Let me just say something about what the Japanese economic scheme is all about. Because on the one side, there was a grand plan to create a greater East Asian economy. And in some ways, it made a lot of sense. It made much more sense than the British Empire, which was just a collection kind of random places that didn't fit together. But if you look at East Asia, Northeast Asia, you had a very strong industrial zone. In China, you had a huge market and a huge labor force. Southeast Asia, you had a lot of natural resources. So you put that together, and it actually makes a certain amount of sense. And that's the underlying logic of this whole Greater East Asia concept. But at the same time, the Japanese were also emphasizing something else, which was a lot of, I guess you'd call it local production. And it's quite funny to me now, because if you look at what's happening in, say, North America, there are people who are trying to get away from using imported foods. They're saying, let's concentrate on what is grown locally. Eat locally produced food, so you don't have so much carbon involved in shipping apples from Australia. You can just have locally produced goods. Well, that's pretty much what the Japanese were trying to do during the war, was to get people to rely on local production. But as shortages grew, they were relying on local production for just about everything. And clearly, many localities couldn't produce what people needed. So you have a lot of malnutrition, you have people just unable to get basic supplies of things. And I might add, this continues after the end of the war. I mean, one of the things that is really striking, you read about wars, and you say, well, it starts on this date, it ends on this date. So the war ended in the middle of August 1945. Well, all that happened then was the Japanese surrendered, so there's not going to be any more fighting. The shortages, the lack of shipping, the malnutrition, none of that changes because the Japanese have surrendered. And it takes years to rebuild the economy.
Probably, may I just add, additionally, is the Japanese military will requisition any available food or any oil or whatever, because they will come and take more of it. So, in a sense that people in the rural area fed better than those in the urban area. Okay. There's a gentleman? Yes.
From Penang. I'm just curious for one thing. Between the surrender of the Japanese, you say that on the 26th of August, the Rangoon Agreement, and on the 9th of September, when the British landed in Malaya, those essential 2 weeks, you were saying that the Japanese are helping to take care of law and order in the country, but to your knowledge, were there any other struggles going on in the country, like for example, communism or some nationalistic struggles going on at that time?
Well, the Japanese were told they had to be responsible for this sort of thing, but the Japanese forces by that time really had lost their authority. What they were able to do during the occupation, if somebody didn't follow their orders, they could arrest them, they could torture them, they could kill them. After the Japanese surrender, they can't do any of that. So they've lost their authority effectively. And yes, all the things you were suggesting, of course, went on. You have, there are endless stories about this, about people coming out of the jungle, taking revenge on people who had collaborated with the Japanese, attempts to take control of local district offices, things of that kind. And yes, there was a period in there where there is simply no effective authority. And various people who think, okay, this is an opportunity to position ourselves differently once it settles down. I mean, nobody quite knows how it's going to settle down, but the assumption is that the British are going to come back, which they do. But in the meantime, they're not there. So many things can happen and do.
Yes, the gentleman.
My name is Lee. You stated that to a large extent there was a lot of tedium after 1 or 2 years after the occupation. Could you tell us a bit on the lighter vein? There must have been some sort of entertainment industry of sorts, and the role of the comfort women for the Japanese military, and whether that issue has been resolved between the Japanese and the Malaysian governments. Thank you.
One of these things that people like to talk about. It certainly happened. There in some countries, the Philippines in particular, former comfort women have come forward and they've said, "I was a comfort woman. This is what happened to me." I don't think very many women in Malaysia have ever come forward. So there's anecdotal, a fair number of anecdotes. One of the accounts, the autobiographical accounts of what happens when the Japanese arrive, there's a woman who, I can't remember what her husband was, but I think he was something fairly senior in government. And a Japanese officer comes to her house, and effectively he's about to rape her. And she says, well, she escaped this by persuading him that she could arrange for women in Penang to basically become prostitutes for the Japanese. What she does is turn to local prostitutes and to persuade them that they should now service the Japanese. And so he spared her because she volunteered to do that. You could find that kind of story, but if you're looking for discovering how many, where, all these details, I don't think it's ever come out.
I think hardly a couple of weeks ago, it was mentioned in our parliament that the Japanese had given us a compensation of something like $207 million, and that has not been distributed since 2004, except in one case where the father of our Chief Justice was quietly paid off for those who suffered. Do you know anything about that, sir? Because that also is linked with that.
Okay. You wanted to ask? Okay, that gentleman there.
Kratoska, Dr. Wee. My name is Kalai. I'm a Future Minister. I head a small study team for group, private study group for Wawasan Railway, people who went and died there. In doing one of the research, I found that along the way that actually both signed a treaty with the Japanese in return for recognition of their Azad Hind, whereby Japan was in paper at least surrendered the Nicobar, the Andaman to both in order to be established a de facto government. And I saw that treaty was in one of the books that you published, that 6-volume books, and I had a sneak preview in Google Books. And I tried to look for it in our national archives, and I couldn't find it. But then I found
Look for the treaty, you mean?
the treaty.
Yeah.
And